Good morning. So we have about 18 billion years of history to get through in the next 2 hours, so I hope you're ready to... I knew that would get some people's attention. I'm very excited to be here today. I'm actually here most Sundays, I'm excited here today to be able to talk a little bit about something that's near and dear to my heart that I'm very passionate about. The title they gave me was, Does God Exist? The undertitle could have really been God and Science, which I think you guys have heard in various forms at times. But it's very near and dear to my heart simply because of my past. And so one of the things I always do when I start one of these talks is always chastise you to make sure you're asking, who's talking to me? Who's giving me information? Who should I be listening to? I know we can go on the internet today, we can click on YouTube, we can pick up any topic we want, and there's somebody there that's got an opinion about something, and we are supposed to believe it. And most of us, if we don't have our thinking caps on, will hear something, and we go right about our day repeating it as if it's true. And I think something that's very important is always to ask, who is giving me the information that they want me to believe? Now, it doesn't mean that you should necessarily believe them because they have a lot of letters after their names, but it is a good validation or a vetting point to say, well, at least they've studied a lot, and perhaps they have some knowledge to impart. And so, one of the things I want to do is give you a little bit about my background, give you an idea of where I'm coming from, because we all have opinions. And so I have an opinion about all of this, and I think it'll be very helpful for you to understand a little bit more about me. This, of course, is the last of the series of 4 that we had. We started out with God hates religion, and he really does. He really wants a relationship. Then we moved on through the other topics that we've seen and heard, and we've been moved in, and we saw that the Bible is really accurate, it can be trusted. We saw that Jesus really isn't a liar or a lunatic, but he's really Lord. And now we're really coming down to the central question: does God exist? And so we're going to dive into, like I said, 18 billion years of history, and hopefully we'll walk out of here saying, I really do believe God exists. Now, my background, I grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of South Carolina, one of 33 grandchildren. My grandmother's 95, still lives on the farm by herself. All of my relatives go visit her all the time. I'm the only one that moved above the Mason-Dixon line. I'm also the only one that went to college. Nobody went to college. You got on the 3rd shift as soon as you finished high school, so you can start making money. And my grandmother recently, I went down, you see all these letters behind my name here, she asked me about 4 years ago, son, do you have a job yet? Yeah, I got a job. That's good, okay. That gives you a little bit of an idea of the backwoods of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And so anyway, coming through life, I studied music first for about 10 years. So I have that emotional side. I was first chair All-State. And what I did, I was passionate about music theory, went on to school, realized quickly I did not want to do that to make a living. Luckily, I enjoyed science, I enjoyed math, and I became pre-med for about 5 weeks. Luckily, they made you go see an autopsy at the beginning. And my God, was someone they found in the woods. And I decided very quickly I do not want to be touching bodies. And so I moved from biology to chemistry, where I could make medicines to save people, but I wouldn't have to touch them. I ended up getting a PhD. I went to Brown University. I worked for a guy named Suggs, who invented a very famous reagent that he's named for. He worked for a Nobel laureate named E.J. Corey. So I have in one of my lineages a Nobel laureate prize winner. Then I went on to Harvard, and I was working on biology for a while. And as a chemist, I actually published in the journal Cell. That may mean nothing to you, but to be a chemist and to publish in one of the most premier biologically focused journals is a huge deal. I worked for a guy named Stuart Schreiber, who's on the short list to win the Nobel Prize. And he worked for another guy, R.B. Woodward, who came up with a lot of rules for all of us as chemists, who won the Nobel Prize. So as a scientist, I have a pretty good lineage behind me there of people that I was trained by, so I feel kind of comfortable in the realm of talking about chemistry and biology. The great thing about scientists, we're all pretty arrogant for the most part, and believe we can read about anything and understand it, but that really isn't the case, so we all have to be careful about where we've been trained. After I finished at Harvard, at that point, I was a non-believer. I'd grown up really religious down south and decided when I went to Brown, the cool people didn't believe in God. And so I wanted to be a cool person, so I decided I don't believe And I pretty much got adamant about it. By the time I got to Harvard, I was trying to reduce people to tears that believed in God, and I thought, what an idiot. I mean, how could you possibly believe in God when all this science is in front of you? And it was about that time that I met a person. I won't get into the long story here. We'll be here for 2.5 hours. But in a period of about 5 days, made a huge transition from an atheist to studying the Bible to getting baptized. Brian O'May had studied the Bible with me. And I remember when they sang this song, one of the first times, I started crying. Because it says, our God, He is alive. And that's still something every time I hear it after 25 years, I get emotional. Because it really reminds me of the fact that we're not all there is. There is something bigger out there. And without further ado, now that you know where I come from and my opinions on things, at least when I'm giving you some of this knowledge that I want to impart, I hope it's able to help you answer a few questions. If you're a Christian, it'll strengthen your convictions about not to be swayed in the winds of what people are saying out there. And if you're coming today to go, what does he have to say? I hope I sparked some interest in you to say, wow, I guess science doesn't really have all the answers about why there isn't a God, although science gives us a lot of illumination on what God is doing behind the scenes. Next slide. So a few things we're going to talk about. Oh, you're going to have to move much faster here, Kristen. There we go. They wouldn't let me control it. I told them to give me the controller. So today we're going to be defining some terms to make sure we all start in the same place. The two biggest questions about science and God, or does God exist, is where did life come from? And the bigger question is, where did the universe come from? When did it start? And then we got some conclusions to talk about. Next slide. Some of the terms I want to talk about today are the ones that are loaded with emotion. We have to get these out of the way first, and once we got them out of the way and figure out what they mean, then we can move more into the information, and you can make some decisions about what you believe. So we're going to be talking about science versus religion. We're going to talk a little bit about atheism versus creationism, and then we're going to talk about evolution versus the theory of evolution, which are two very different things. Next slide. So the first thing here I wanted to just mention to you was, really, everybody knows this picture. This is Einstein. And Einstein is famous for the theory of relativity, plus a lot of other things that he did. Interestingly, he was a patent examiner in the Swiss patent office. And after I finished at Harvard, I actually went to the ministry, worked for 10 years as a missionary in Germany, came back, couldn't get a job as a chemist anywhere, even though my wonderful pedigree, because when you've left chemistry for more than 3 years, they all consider the fact that you know nothing anymore. And I luckily found a job at a law firm which trained me to become a patent agent. Then I went to law school, and now I'm a patent partner in one of the top 50 law firms in the world. And I have a very large practice. It's all on drugs and how to make medicines and clean technology. But it's exciting, and I'd love to be able to trace my roots back to someone as smart as Einstein, at least from the patent perspective. Actually, he failed at it. That's why he left. And so he became a scientist. Anyway, he was asked in 1955, he was given an interview about the theory of relativity, and he talked about one of his largest mistakes of his life, and it's considered a mistake. Einstein in the 30s was going through the equations on the size of the universe, what was going on with the universe. And what you have to remember is, at that time, the strong belief was the universe was at steady state, meaning that we didn't know when it began and we didn't know if it was going to end. There was a lot of the first and second laws of thermodynamics that seemed to be violated because of the age of the universe and what was going on. And as Einstein was working on his theory of relativity, his equations showed him it went back to a beginning. There had to have been a beginning if you followed his equations all the way to the end. So he threw in a cosmological constant, that's the name of it, in there that kind of got rid of the idea that you had to go all the way back to a beginning. But around that same time, another famous person, Hubble, I'm sure you've all heard of Hubble, the Hubble telescope maybe. Hubble was the one that began to observe what's called redshifts in the universe, and that means that the wavelengths of light, that light that's closer to you moving fast is blue, and light that's moving very slowly like this is more red. So the spectrum goes from red to blue. And so when they began to look out into the universe and they could see clearly, certain stars weren't white like what we see, certain stars look red, and certain stars look blue. Blue meant the wavelength was getting shorter and shorter, which meant it was coming at you. Kind of like the Doppler effect when you hear a siren, it's going woo, as it gets louder, it gets closer, and then it goes away, and it's woo, 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 woo. Yeah. That's the same with wavelengths of light. You know my music, see, that's my music. And the stars that are red are actually moving away from you. So as they began to see the redshift in the universe, they realized stars were continuing to move. They were in movement. That meant somewhere they weren't moving, and then they started moving, and they continued to move. And if there was movement, that meant there must have been a beginning. There was an explosion. Something happened to start them moving. And this is where Einstein moved from being an atheist to being what's called a deist. The idea is that he got to the point of, well, there must have been a God, because I don't know any other way everything could have started, but he's an impersonal God who doesn't really care about your everyday human beings. He just kind of set everything in motion. But see, science and religion really are not enemies. Actually, it's a relatively new phenomenon, probably about the last 50 years, that science has moved into being much more antagonistic to religion, and religion, in response, has become antagonistic in many ways to science. And they're really not enemies. Turn to the next slide. Many Bible-believing scientists founded areas of science only because they believed in the order of the universe. And what that means is, as scientists, if we didn't believe that everything was ordered, we could not set up an experiment to test a hypothesis, or to even go on from a hypothesis to set up a theory for ourselves. We have to believe that if we perturb something, we're going to see a response. And if we do that perturbation over and over again, we get the same response. That's the idea of order. And these scientists believe God is a God of order. His universe is a God, universe of order. I was trying to come up with a different word, but that didn't happen. And I was coming for a while too. I failed miserably, so I had to stop that. But because of this order, scientists believe they could go in and do this. And chemists and physicists understand the whole idea of electrodynamics, electromagnetism, and gas dynamics. Without these things, we would not have much of what we have today in terms of space flight and where we go to explore. Now, next slide. What has science told us? Science has told us the universe began about 15 to 18 billion years ago. You can actually measure the redshift out and get an idea of the entire breadth of the universe. As far as we know, it's continuing to move. It's continuing to go out beyond us. The Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. First life that we've seen so far on Earth is about 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. That number in between those two is going to be very important in a little while. That is a mere 500 million. That is an infant in terms of time when it comes to development of life, and that's going to come back to haunt us in just a moment. And humans have been around about 250,000 years. So on the global, now we finished the 15 billion years of history. We're ready to go. Next slide. Now, Judeo-Christian tradition tells us a few different things here that we need to understand about the Bible as we put this in the context of religion. The Bible tells us, it presents an absolute truth. There is a God, there's Jesus, Jesus resurrected from the dead. We need to believe in that to become Christians in order to go to heaven. Those are absolutes. Whether you believe them or not, that's what the position the Bible takes. It's very absolute. Many theories have been set forth and subsequently abandoned when you begin looking at science. People put things out there, they test it as they should, they either alter it, change it, or abandon it and move on somewhere else. The Bible complements science. The Bible addresses why and who. It does not really get into what and when. Science, however, very, very adequately addresses what and when. We can measure time, and we can see things as they occur. The Bible, however, is not a science book. This is where a lot of problems occur. People, even believers, try to go to the Bible and prove scientific things, and that's not what the Bible is to be used for. However, every single time the Bible touches on science, it's accurate. It has never been proven to be inaccurate, unlike many other world books on religion that touch on things and get them completely wrong, and sometimes in a way that really you look at it and go, how could you read any other part of the book if that part is in there? Next slide. Now, scientific accuracy before its time. Here's a passage that was written about 3,500 years ago. Whoever touches the dead body of anyone will be unclean for 7 days. He must purify himself with water on the 3rd and 7th day, take some hyssop, dip it in the water, sprinkle the tent furnishings, and the people who are there. Now you read that and you go, you take a plant, you dip it in the water, somebody's touched a dead body, you sprinkle stuff all over him. On the 3rd day and the 7th, it sounds like voodoo, doesn't it? Oh, come on, it sounds like voodoo, doesn't it? And that's the way a lot of people read the Bible. It sounds like voodoo. Well, remember, the Israelites were in bondage written. And at the same time, the Egyptians, who they were surrounded by, were taking cow dung, putting it in water and smearing it on the open sores of people to try to heal them. So the Israelites are amongst these people doing that stuff when this is written in the Bible at the same time on what they need to be doing. Next slide. Now this was validated in 1847. It turns out in maternity, you saw this 2 weeks ago when the validity of the Bible was being taught. In maternity wards, 1 out of every 6 women were dying of what was called childbed fever. The obstetricians were ascribing it to constipation. I mean, women were dying of constipation when they were having babies. The women were dying of fear, or the women were dying of poisonous air. Now, none of this is medically correct, but there was one doctor, turn to the next slide, please. Semmelweis realized when he was delivering babies that if he merely, when he left the autopsy room touching dead bodies, would wash his hands and go in and then deliver the babies, many of the women he touched didn't get sick. Many of the other doctors felt it was too burdensome for them to wash their hands after touching a dead body and going in and helping a woman give birth. The death rate fell where Semmelweis was from 18% of women, 1 out of every 5 dying of this constipation or fear or whatever, down to only 1%. 1 out of 100 women were dying when they were under his care because he was simply washing his hands. It turns out he was washing with an antiseptic. And one of the antiseptics that he didn't use, but is very similar, is the hyssop. It produces thymol. Thymol is this organic structure here, which is a very powerful antimicrobial. That was the one that God told the Israelites 3,500 years ago, take that plant, dip it in water, sprinkle it on the person who had touched a dead body, like the autopsy room with the doctors. So God was ahead of the time telling the Israelites how to protect themselves when the rest of the world wasn't understanding or getting it right. There's many other areas. These are only just a few. All of the known world back around the time of the Israelites believed that only man had the seed. The Bible clearly teaches it's man and woman that come together that produce the seed. Quarantining of disease. The Bible told the Israelites, if you see mold in your house, call my arsenal. No. If you see mold in your house, tear the house down. Take it outside the city and burn it. Leave it. Get rid of it. The rest of the world wasn't doing that. And there was many other instances where when disease appeared, they quarantined those people away until they healed, and then the rest of the population wasn't infected. Seaworthy design. The great ship of the ark. It is still the dimensions that are used today to build large seaworthy ships. And then, of course, the water cycle is described in the Bible and the book of Amos. Next slide. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of the accuracy of the Bible. That when it touches on science, it's accurate. But of course, it doesn't tell you everything because it's not a science notebook. Now, other loaded words are atheism and creationism. Not every scientist is an atheist. I want you to know that. So when even you sometimes say, scientists don't believe, you're kind of lumping us all in one bucket there, and that's not really fair. So there are a lot of scientists who are atheists. There are atheists out there that are not scientists. But the position of the atheist today is actually an extreme position. And the rest of us are kind of in the middle there, over to the other side, which are the creationists. And creationism is defined in one particular way. Now, there's a lot of different ways of looking at creationists. I really believe God created the world. But creationist with a big C has other meanings, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And every single Bible believer out there is not a creationist with a big C. Both of these are minority positions that are on the extremes of either side. And most of us would find ourselves somewhere in the middle on that spectrum. Neither one of these positions is well supported by science. Now, what are these positions, you're probably asking? Next slide. Richard Dawkins, famous scientist from England, one of the most avowed atheists out there, written many books. This is a quote from one of his books here, A River Out of Eden. And bottom line is, if I have my pretty little pointer here, I point these things out to you. But basically what he points out to here is right in the dead center there. He's talking about the fact that there's a blind physical force that's in charge of the universe. He also talks about the fact that there's no design on the fourth line, no purpose. And here's the key point for many atheists. No evil and no good. There's no judgment on the behavior of anybody in the world. Because if there's not a cause giver or a God, then who's to be the judge of everyone else? This is postmodernism. This came out. This arrived on the scene when the Nazis were being tried in Germany. The German defense was, what we did was right for us. I'll call that the Nazi defense. I lived in Germany and that's offensive. The Nazi defense was, who are you to judge us? There is no outside judge. Therefore, what's right for you in the United States or England may not be right for us inside Germany. So, thank you very much. Leave us alone. And so that was the naturalistic side of where people were going in the 40s and 50s. And it's just been an extension for the last 50 years. If you look that up historically, you'll find that that's true. Now, the next slide here is the other...